fun news debate on TV where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
He is the man at the centre of global drama, the protagonist in a narrative of bloodshed and war that many thought had been consigned to history. As the world battles against the clock to figure out just how far the Russian president might go and how to contain his warmongering, we try to get inside Putin's mind with our exclusive GB News special, From Vlad to Bad. Is the Russian president untethered, unhinged and unstoppable? We ask those who have met him and a professional psychologist. Can anybody stand up to Putin? Few have tried, often with lethal consequences. We speak to exiles who have faced the wrath of the Russian president. And life through a lens. Like most dictators, information control is central to Putin's regime. How does he shape the media? And how has media shaped the West's relationship with Russia? Stay tuned for the next hour to this exclusive GB News special as I delve inside the mind of the man waging war on Europe. I'm back after the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB Newsroom. NATO entering fighting in Ukraine could lead to widespread war in Europe. That's according to Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. That as Boris Johnson calls Moscow's shelling of a nuclear power station in Ukraine a direct threat to all safety of all of Europe. The Zaporizhzhia power plant, the largest in Europe, caught fire overnight and has been seized by Russian forces. The UN Human Rights Office says 331 civilians have been killed and 675 have been injured so far in the Ukraine conflict. Speaking in Brussels earlier, Stoltenberg said NATO isn't seeking a war with Russia.
With the cities under siege, schools, hospitals, and residential buildings shelled, reckless actions around a nuclear power plant last night, and many civilians killed or wounded. The days to come are likely to be worse.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg there. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on the Russian people to take action against their government.
Russian people, I want to appeal to you. How is this possible? After all, we fought together in 1986 against the consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. How could you ever forget about it? If you did not forget, then you must not keep silent. You must tell your authorities. Go out on the streets and say that you want to live on the land without radioactive contamination. Radiation does not know where Russia is.
Volodymyr Zelensky. The Foreign Secretary says allies are prepared to tighten the vice around Putin's war machine amid an intense day of diplomacy in Europe. Liz Truss is attending a series of meetings with G7 leaders and EU ministers at NATO's headquarters in Brussels. One topic on the agenda will be cutting Europe's dependency on Russian oil and gas. Speaking in Denmark earlier, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says Russia is playing with fire.
Russian armed forces has in its arsenal a whole range of horrors that go way beyond capabilities that we would choose to have if you're complying with Geneva Conventions, the thermobaric vacuum bombs, for example, that we see in their inventory, in the way they are used, the cluster munitions that many of our countries have banned, those are weapons they still use. And the worrying signs from President Putin is, in his words, he seems to indicate no limit.
Earlier, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab said Vladimir Putin's at risk of ending up in prison for alleged war crimes carried out by his Russian forces in Ukraine. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says there have been civilian atrocities, but also says they have to trust in international law.
When bombs fall on your cities, when soldiers rape women in the occupied cities, and we have numerous cases, it's difficult, of course, to speak about the efficiency of the international law. But this is the only tool of civilization that is available to us to make sure that in the end, eventually, all those who made this war possible will be brought to justice.
In the capital, Kyiv, reports of several explosions and air raid sirens. That as residents continue to build metal anti-tank barriers known as hedgehogs in a bid to slow Russia's advances. Russian troops advance on the city, meanwhile, of Mykolaiv, near the Black Sea between Odessa and Kherson. That's according to its mayor. A Ukrainian presidential advisor, though, says they've managed to drive the troops back. Meanwhile, authorities in Mariupol, also in the south, say it remains under constant attack, including residential areas. The Home Secretary has arrived in Poland to meet Ukrainians seeking to flee to the UK. She's there to launch the Ukraine Family Scheme, which allows anyone settled in the United Kingdom to bring their Ukrainian family to safety. Ms. Patel says the British government's doing everything it can to support the Ukrainian people as they fight for freedom. In other news, Paulette Hamilton has won the Birmingham Erdington by-election, holding the Labour seat. A nurse of 25 years, Ms Hamilton becomes the first black MP to represent a Birmingham constituency. In her victory speech, she expressed her admiration for the work done by her predecessor, Jack Dromey, who died in January. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Alex and Putin from Vlad to Bat.
For the past decade, Vladimir Putin has inspired admiration and respect, distrust and disgust in equal measure. Popular, yet polarizing. Inscrutable and catastrophically underestimated. At one point, he was regarded a modernizer, dragging his country out of communism and confining it to the dustbin of history, embracing capitalism and international engagement to elevate Russia back into a superpower, growing its economy with one hand, looting it with the other. Able to murder in cold blood on foreign soil one day and sign a multi-billion-dollar bilateral agreement the next. Diminutive, enigmatic, steely and slick, Putin has charmed and cajoled through a blend of facilitation and fear. Just a fortnight ago, a conveyor belt of world leaders queued up to parley with Putin, all convinced that he would stop short of invading Ukraine. All needing to be convinced, having eaten from the palm of his hand for the past 2 decades. All waking up to the realization that Putin's long game has been moving them around like pieces on a chessboard. All now scrambling to figure out what he wants and how far he will go to get it. Some suggest Putin has changed, a sudden deterioration in mental health as he isolated himself from officials, gripped by bitterness and paranoia, stripping his inner circle to a privy council of equally deluded and detached yes-men. Others would say the mark of a true sociopath is one able to emotionlessly conceal his intentions and patiently, coldly execute a strategy. One thing, however, is understood by all. Ending war in Europe means ending Putin's despotic grip. I'm joined now by Keir Giles, expert in Russian power projection at the foreign affairs think tank Chatham House. Now, Keir, you've warned for a long time about Putin's intentions. Why has the West been blind to his perils?
I think largely because so much of what I and colleagues were warning about seemed so incredible, so fantastical to people who thought that we'd already emerged from the eras of despots who would seek to arrive at an imperial ambition, gathering Europe together under their own control. It just seemed that it was something from another period of history, that President Putin's ambition to roll back the clock to the 20th century or even before was so out of place for European statecraft, for European diplomats and leaders, that it just wasn't possible to believe all of the things that President Putin was saying about what he wanted and how he might be prepared to go about getting them. But it's not true that it has been a sudden shift in President Putin's demeanor and in the way in which he's engaging with the outside world. This has been a trend which we've seen over some time. We've looked at both the ways that Russia has moved back towards its hostility towards the outside world and domestically at home, of course, hostility towards its own population as well. The latest moves in Russia's repression of its own subjects are just the end of a long progression where it started clamping down and returning to those Soviet approaches of controlling people, controlling the information they received a long time ago. So put it all together, and yes, it's true that the warnings were there, but you can understand why people didn't listen to them, because it just made no sense.
Is there anybody now with access to Putin who might be able to stop him, or has he become a very isolated man?
Well, it's one of the theories, certainly, that Putin, particularly over the course of the last year and a bit, where COVID, of course, has presented a big problem to Putin's interactions with real people, because he has become more and more physically isolated from them, retreating for months at a time to Sochi on the Black Sea, not even being in the Kremlin. There is this strong and persuasive theory that actually, yes, because of that failure to receive any more information about what's happening from the outside world, other than through his trusted circle of inner advisors who only will bring him the things that he actually wants to hear, that he's retreated further and further down the rabbit hole of his own conspiracy theories and into his own slightly disjointed view of how the world works. And that's then what we see being expressed in these actions by President Putin, attacking Ukraine on the basis of a complete fiction about what Ukraine really is. And we have to think back, of course, to his meeting of his own Security Council shortly before the invasion was launched, which was this grotesque parody of a government meeting where ministers and intelligence chiefs were fluffing their lines and being publicly mocked by Putin. And of course, then afterwards, they decided that the recording of that mockery was suitable to be broadcast on state television. But that gave us the indications that there are very few or no people who will actually say no to Putin.
How much is this down to Putin's personality as well? He often likes to portray himself as a macho man. I mean, are there people who support him, who are there to provide him favour, or does everyone essentially live in fear?
Well, the two, of course, are not mutually exclusive. It can be both of them. And it's fascinating at the moment to look at how ordinary Russians, when they are interviewed and contacted about what's happening in Ukraine, how they respond. They've been inculcated for so long with Russian state media propaganda that they, too, have a very limited view of what's actually happening in the outside world. Now, you'll hear a lot about the appeal of a strong leader to Russia and how you have to demonstrate that you are sufficiently manly to run the country. But at the same time, we need to remember that Putin is also under challenge from his own domestic economy and the ways in which Russians eventually might realize the track down which they've been led.
Now, military analysts often talk about creating an off-ramp or a golden bridge across which your enemy is able to retreat. Is that anywhere in sight? Is that possible? Or has Putin gone so far down his rabbit hole that it's very hard to turn him around?
Well, you mentioned before the procession of diplomats and leaders that were going to Moscow to try to cajole President Putin out of invading. But the problem then is the same as the problem now. The gap between what President Putin thinks is happening in the world and what the rest of the world sees seems pretty much unbridgeable. And so too with his demands on Ukraine, what he's actually stated that he wanted, which is effectively not short of eliminating Ukraine as a state and eliminating Ukrainians as a people and fulfilling his own fantasy of them actually being the same as Russians and not a separate independent nation. When the demands are so absolute, it's hard to see how there can be any compromise there. And of course, offering Putin what he wants, trying to persuade the Ukrainians to make concessions, to give Putin what he wants, to roll back their own sovereignty, will of course only encourage him further. Just as we've seen the pattern of Russian military interventions over the last couple of decades, once and again, actually reinforcing in President Putin's mind that military intervention and military assault is the best way to get his way, because other countries will back down, and the West in particular, being so afraid of confronting Putin, will assist Russia in imposing terms on its victims.
Keir Giles, thank you ever so much for coming on the programme. Consulting Fellow, Russia and Eurasia at Chatham House. Well, let's talk to our very own economics editor, who few of you probably know actually lived in Russia, can speak Russian, and indeed has even met Vladimir Putin a number of times. Liam, I mean, first of all, you've met the man. What's he like in the flesh?
Well, I first met Vladimir Putin in the mid-1990s. Just after the breakup of the Soviet Union, he was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg, who was a very liberal politician called Anatoly Sobchak, a very Western-oriented politician, a politician very interested in bringing foreign investment into what had just become, the new country of Russia, having broken away from the Soviet Union. So Putin really, back in those days, hitched his wagon to the most kind of pro-reformist politician in the country. And when I met him, and he speaks pretty good English, by the way, he speaks very, very good German. When I met him, he was trying to drum up foreign investment for what was Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Russia's second city, a city of 6-7 million people. And he was pretty good at it. He was pretty good at wooing Western investors, Western journalists, convincing them that Russia had changed, convincing them that Russia was a major commercial opportunity. And in the years that followed, there were ups and downs and lumps and bumps. It was a major commercial and economic opportunity. And that's why, Alex, in the 30 years since the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dissolved, many thoroughbred Western companies have invested very, very heavily in Russia indeed. And many of them now, of course, are rushing for the door.
I mean, Putin, in that respect, was a marked change from his predecessors. He essentially pivoted from communism to capitalism. But let's talk a little bit about how he may have got there. I mean, this man grew up in relative poverty, ended up being an officer in the KGB. What can you tell us about the journey of young Putin to the president of Russia?
Well, Putin was born in what was Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, really at the height of the Soviet Union. He was born the year before Stalin died. He was born in 52, Stalin died in 53. Stalin was then replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who was much more reformist and who criticized Stalin famously, but was still very much a Soviet leader who would butt heads with the West when he banged his shoe famously and said, "We will bury you." He promoted the Soviet Union as a sort of technological force. And that's the atmosphere that Vladimir Putin grew up in. Like many very, very bright young people, he joined the security services. That wasn't unusual. This was a totalitarian dictatorship, of course. But Putin's of that generation where they grew up getting to the top of one society, and that society then completely collapsed. So they had to rapidly reinvent themselves. And he did reinvent himself. He went from working for Sobchak as a kind of special advisor, you'd call it here in the UK. Then he became the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and then he segued to Moscow. A lot then, back in the mid and late 90s, when I was living in Russia the first time, I also lived in Russia in 2010 for a few years onwards, in the early 2010s. Back in those days, though, in the mid-90s, the Moscow government was dominated by smart, scientific, technocratic people from St. Petersburg, of which Vladimir Putin was definitely one, because that St. Petersburg set, Yegor Gaidar was another a well-known Russian reformer. They were seen as the more outward-looking, more modern members of that previous Soviet elite that would take Russia towards capitalism. And for much of his presidency, and he's been president formally since the year 2000. There was a sort of interregnum period where Dmitry Medvedev became president for between 2008 and 2012. But he's basically been the president of Russia since 1999, 2000. And during much of the early part of that presidency, he was a very outward-looking president. He did help to bring lots of foreign direct investment to Russia. You'll remember, Alex, after 9/11 in 2001, Putin was pretty much the first global leader who phoned Bush And Bush was very moved, and they met, and the Russians said to the Americans, if you want to base yourself in former Soviet countries, in Kazakhstan, if you want to attack Afghanistan from our bases, that's fine. And George Bush famously said, when I look into his eyes, I can see his soul of Vladimir Putin. How far we've come since then, when there was quite a lot of rapprochement. And of course, at that time, Putin was suggesting, well, maybe we can join NATO. And at that time, that wasn't a joke. How far we've come.
Indeed, from capitalism to kleptocracy, it seems, and from a westward-leaning Russian president to one who seems to want to wage war against us. Liam, thank you very much. You can join our special today by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk and follow our updates and clips from this show at GBNews on Twitter. You are with GB News on TV and radio. It's time for a short break now, but first let's have a look at the weather.
Hello. Big contrasts with the weather this Friday. A fairly dull, dismal day across much of the east. Whereas in the west, well, there are one or two showers, but many places dry and bright with some spring sunshine, thanks to this little ridge of high pressure. This weather front, though, has been with us for a few days now, and it's just ground to a halt across these eastern parts of England, bringing thick cloud, rain and drizzle on and off for much of the day. Parts of eastern Scotland also being affected. Parts of East Anglia still largely dry, and we could reach double figures in Norwich with a bit of brightness, but stuck under this rain band from Newcastle to Hull. Temperatures really only 5, 6, 7 at best. Further west, a few showers for Wales and southwest England, but many places dry and bright, and temperatures 8, 9, 10 Celsius. Through this evening, we'll keep a few showers in the west, and we'll keep that wet weather across the east, although it should start to peter out across the far northeast of England. Staying fairly soggy, though, across East Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and rain on and off across southeast England and East Anglia for most of the night. Keeping the temperatures up here, but with clearer skies further west, a frost likely, certainly for Scotland, Northern Ireland, a fairly widespread frost to start the weekend, but should be some cracking sunshine here on Saturday. Now, yesterday we thought this rain may be a little further north, but now it looks like it will be mostly across these eastern parts of England, south of Lincolnshire into the East Midlands. A dull, damp day here on Saturday. Brighter skies for Wales and southwest England, some sunshine likely here, and as I said, a fine day for Scotland and Northern Ireland. After that, early frost temperatures picking up to 8 or 9 degrees, but it's quite a bit colder than that, stuck under that thick cloud, rain and drizzle, which will persist across these eastern parts of England, and easterly winds starting to pick up as well. That will eventually start to chase the rain away during Saturday night and into Sunday. Just a few showers on Sunday, but many places dry, with a fair bit of cloud across England and Wales and a cold easterly wind blowing too.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Vladimir Putin's cult of kleptocracy is often talked about. The powerful oligarchs that prop up his presidency, the uncompromising assassination of enemies, a mercurial distrust feeding both fear and favour in those around him, the influence of his brutal KGB roots and preference to surround himself with similar individuals in his Privy Council. Those who dare to cross him can be certain of calculated retribution. But do his cronies truly subscribe to Putinism? Does he trust anybody? And is there anybody who could challenge or influence the man waging war in Europe? Joining me first is Marina Litvinienko, widow of former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, who was fatally poisoned. Marina, it's a privilege to have you on the programme. Your tragic and notorious assassination of your husband that the world remembers. Do you think that those were on the personal orders of Vladimir Putin?
I would say, first of all, good afternoon. I'm not only thinking, I have a very proof evidence. It was not only my emotional discussion. We have a proper police investigation. We have a public inquiry. And this was saying is that Vladimir Putin, as a president of Russia, could be behind of this state crime against of my husband.
I mean, your husband was also an officer in the FSB, previously known as the KGB. How brutal an organisation was it? And do you think that Putin has the full support of the SFB today?
I would like to say it's quite different because Vladimir Putin much older than my husband, and he was definitely officer of KGB, and he'd been educated during the Cold War. My husband, Sasha, joined KGB when it was completely destroyed after 1991. And he really believed he will build a new security service who would help people to go through all of this difficult time. And he fight against organized crime, against terrorism, before he realized this state became a very dangerous place for all people to live in.
I mean, having seen the lengths that the Kremlin goes to silence detractors and defectors, do you think there's anybody now who can stand up to him? And do you also fear for your own safety?
But, you know, if we will all fear how we can live, it's exactly we're now discussing how is it possible this monster grow up all these 20 years and nobody could see it? It was absolutely from very first year. All people ask, who is Mr. Putin? And of course, it was a quite serious concern. He is a former officer of KGB. But all leaders try to be blind how you just made this sentence, because we all wanted to have a good relationship to Russia. We all have to have a business. And we really supported ordinary Russian. And we'd like to support business in Russia. But Putin never changed. Putin, he is exactly who he was from very beginning. He represented these old-style KGB officers. And now they just started to take revenge for what happened after 1991.
I would assume that, given that your husband knew Vladimir Putin so very well, you must have had access to the man yourself. Can you describe your interpretation of his character and his personality? Do you believe him to be a cold-blooded sociopath?
I can't say I know Putin very well, but now being close this last 16 years or even more, 20 years, of course I could say I know something about him. But when my husband Sasha met him during professional meeting to discuss about criminality and FSB, because Putin just became director of FSB in 1998. And my husband Sasha was really surprised because he met a person who even didn't pay attention to what Sasha tried to say about this criminality. And this has made him feel this guy absolutely not about changed. And he was a criminality himself.
Marina, thank you ever so much for joining me on the programme. And the world was shocked. I mean, certainly everyone in the UK was shocked by the dreadful assassination of your husband, and we keep him in our heart and our mind always. Thank you so much. That's Marina Litvinienko. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, we'll speak to some of the victims of an often cruel regime. But first, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 2:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. We start with some breaking news. Australian cricket legend Shane Warne has died aged 52. His management have said in a statement that he died of a suspected heart attack at his villa in Thailand. The news is the second devastating blow for Australian cricket within 24 hours, with fellow great Rod Marsh also dying today, having suffered a major heart attack last week. NATO entering or fighting in Ukraine could lead to widespread war in Europe. That's according to Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. That as Boris Johnson calls Moscow's shelling of a nuclear power station in Ukraine a direct threat to the safety of all of Europe. The Zaporizhzhia power plant caught fire overnight and has been seized by Russian forces. Speaking in Brussels in the last couple of hours, Stoltenberg said NATO isn't seeking a war with Russia.
With the cities under siege, schools, hospitals and residential buildings shelled, reckless actions around a nuclear power plant last night, and many civilians killed or wounded. The days to come are likely to be worse.
Russian troops have advanced on the city of Mykolaiv near the Black Sea between Odessa and Kherson. That's according to its mayor. A Ukrainian presidential advisor, though, says they've managed to drive the troops back. Meanwhile, authorities in Mariupol, also in the south, say it remains under constant attack and residential areas are being shelled. In the capital, Kyiv, residents and volunteers are creating metal anti-tank barriers known as hedgehogs in a bid to slow Russia's advances. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. We'll bring you more on the tragic death of Shane Warne in the next bulletin. It's back to Alex with Putin from Vlad to bad in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to our GB News special, Putin from Vlad to bad. And let's return to that issue of the people propping him up and what happens when they fall foul of the Russian president. Joining me now is Russian exile in the UK, Valery Morozov. Now, Valery, very briefly, I mean, sum up your story, but also you've met Putin, you've been in the Kremlin. What is this man like? What is he about?
No, I think that the important thing is that the time has come when, we should really analyze the situation and the relations between the West and Russia, and also understand the differences. The problem is that in the West and in Russia also, most of the people, they think that Russians are the same part of the European civilization. They're the same, but a little bit different. Actually, Russian civilization is absolutely different from Western European civilization, especially. And like Indian civilization is different, Chinese civilization is different, though Russians look the same, but they are based on Slavic, different tribes, groups that were united by certain one and the same development. But nobody takes this into consideration. And when people say, what, Putin is mad, this and that, but simply people don't understand that Russians look at the same situation in different ways and react in different.
Yeah, I mean, he's talked about the Nazification of Ukraine and he is a post-war, you call him an ethnic Russian. How much does he believe his own accusations when he's talking about Nazism in Ukraine?
No, first of all, of course, he believes, and most of the Russians believe in this, that Nazi ideology penetrated in Ukraine and maybe even influences now the politics of Ukraine. That is, of course, most of the Russians believe. That's one thing. But the same what I want to say is that, say, as an example, when British or Western European or Americans, when they start any conflict, they start the conflicting and protecting their own interests. And then with the aggravation of the conflict, they're still, going on and on and on, trying to protect their own interests. And then they come to some agreement or compromise. Russians different because they have different history. And they start with the compromise, trying to find compromise. Then, with the time, if Russia understands that, say, his competitor doesn't understand him, doesn't listen to him, then Russia thinks that they would not agree. They've taken the decision. They will never agree. I will never have a compromise. So there will be a fight. But because of this history, for Russians, invasion or fighting or wars, these are either you win or you are dead. So then, at some point, as it happened with Putin, he decided that the West has decided to start a war, to destroy Russia. And it is not only Putin. This is the opinion in the Kremlin. And then, what he's a KGB officer. He was brought up as KGB officer. Then low down, quiet, and be prepared. And he started preparing throughout all these years. First, in 2007, I think, he was speaking in Munich at the conference. He said, take into consideration our position, our interest. Nobody reacted. And from that time, they started preparing. They prepared new weapons. He invited people whom I knew, who, say, for example, designed new missile systems in Soviet times and were out of their jobs. But he invited them back. They started developing all these things quietly. And then it came at a point when he understood that Ukraine is collapsing as a state, as an economy, and it will be taken by the United States. And he decided that this is the last point where he can retreat. He can never retreat. And this, I am sure, is the decision. The same, he understood that Europe is starting collapsing as an economy. So he is preparing for Ukraine and then Europe. So at one point, he decided that he is prepared. He has no time left. And within 2-3 weeks, he'll finish with Ukraine. And then there will be Europe, who will, because Russia is going with China against the United States. What will happen? I'm not very sure that Europe will be able, at least European economy, will be able to survive.
Harrowing stuff. Valery, thank you so much for coming in and giving us your amazing, amazing insights. Well, let's talk now to Mark Almond, who's director of the Crisis Research Institute at Oxford. He tracks the development and consequences of global, regional and local crises. And Mark, you've been observing Vladimir Putin for some time. Valery there saying that this really is a sort of a battle of retribution against the West. Let's talk a bit about Vladimir the man. I mean, he used to tell the story of growing up in poverty and hunting and killing rats in the basement of the flat he lived in. And once wielding a stick, he fought a big one that, when once cornered, launched itself at him. And it seems to me in this analogy, he is painting himself a little bit as the cornered rat. How far do you think he will go?
Well, in a sense, he's a nuclear-armed rat in this context, and the danger is that he had partly launched this invasion because he felt Russia was being pushed back, cornered by NATO, in effect, as it were, standing behind Ukraine, and the Ukrainian border in the east is only, say, 400 miles from his office in the Kremlin. It's quite a small distance in both Russian historical terms and also in flight times for missiles. But there is this strange sort of psychology, the mixture of being a very big tub-thumping, we are a great nation, I am a powerful leader, and at the same time self-pity. You've cheated us, you misled us in the West, you deceived us, the developments we had in the 1990s led to the theft of our natural resources by Western companies and so on. So there's this mixture, which is quite a potent mixture psychologically, of self-assertion and self-pity. And at the same time, also personally, I think Putin realizes that this is a huge gamble. If it fails, he will fall from power, and he may well fall very brutally. So he has every personal incentive to make sure he wins however much there is a human cost. The other side is, of course, there's a whole team of people around him who have, as it were, dipped their fingers, Lady Macbeth-like, in the blood. And it's quite striking that some of the people like Dmitry Medvedev, the former prime minister and former president, who are often seen as liberals in the West, have been very vehement in what they've said, very hostile to the NATO countries as well as to the Ukrainians. And so if we're looking for the possibility of replacing Putin, I think in the short term, we're likely to find that even if people decide he's a liability, he's got us into a long-term crisis that we need to get out of, they're not necessarily going to be softy type people wanting to compromise with the West, or at least they will demand from the West concessions like recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, perhaps the eastern part of Ukraine as part of Russia, which it would be very difficult for us to do. So even if Putin was to be toppled in a palace coup in the next few days or weeks, I think we should be cautious about thinking that this would make Russia a cozier neighbor immediately.
You said earlier that Putin seems to be a man who would want to win at any cost. But I think what most of the Western world is trying to figure out is quite what it is that he wants to win. Valery earlier talking about that actually he's got issues with the entirety of Europe. Do you think that his ambitions are contained within wanting to annex Belarus and Ukraine, or do you think they go much further than that?
Well, the danger is once you're involved in a war, it radicalizes you. So you might have started out with relatively modest ambitions to suppress Ukrainian independence, to impose a regime that he wanted in Ukraine and get it guaranteed not joining NATO. But the problem is that war makes people become more hardline. You can see this in the war he involved himself in Syria. Tragically, both sides become more and more ruthless towards each other. And at the moment, the NATO leaders, Boris Johnson, President Biden, Stoltenberg, who you've had on your program today, have been treading this very careful line of saying we support Ukraine in every way possible, but we will not start the Third World War. The danger is that Putin may see that as weakness, and he may think if he succeeds, shall we say, for the sake of argument, in overrunning Ukraine in the next few days, 10 days, that he may turn to a small country like Moldova, sandwiched between Ukraine and NATO member Romania. He may even begin to throw his weight around to the NATO members in the Baltic states that he particularly dislikes. And he may think, well, if the Americans, the British and the French wouldn't do anything to save Ukraine, they may balk at starting the Third World War for Estonia and Latvia. A very dangerous mistake, in my view, but nonetheless one that he might make if he feels he's on a roll. So in some ways, horrible though it is for the Ukrainians, every day that they grind out this conflict with huge suffering, in a sense, perhaps blunts the Russians' capacity to go further, and perhaps will make some of Putin's advisors say, boss, why don't we celebrate victory and call it a day?
Mark, thank you so much for joining me and giving me your analysis. It seems that everyone has underestimated Putin. And if there's one thing that we should take from recent events, is that is exactly what we must not do. Now, Vladimir Putin is evidently a man conscious of image. From military pomp and circumstance to his big white table, choreographed pictures and videos of his sporting prowess and outdoorsmanship, gunslinging and bare-chested on horseback. From army fatigues to sharp suits, high-fiving sports stars and hugging children. Every last detail curated and controlled, underscored by a draconian crackdown on media and extreme censorship. The West's portrayal of Putin has been similarly legendary. Voted Time magazine's Person of the Year and Forbes' most powerful man more than any individual in history, world leaders that rushed to glad hand Russia's modern czar now decry his gangster kleptocracy. So how has the West's perception of Russia changed over the years, and how much of that is down to Putin's personal portrayal? Well, who better to understand how Putin has been received and portrayed in the West than one of our very own experts, GB News presenter Alistair Stewart, and of course, veteran ITN presenter at many of the key historic moments of the last few decades, including the fall of the Berlin Wall. Alistair, it's fair to say that in your career, you have indeed cracked a lot of Vladimir Putin's career. What are your main take-homes of how Russia's relationship with the West has changed and where we find ourselves in our relationship with Putin today?
They started off with a massive cock-up, and that was when Gorbachev, who came in 85 and then saw the Berlin Wall fall and did not intervene, crucially. That was the turning point in East-West relations. And Gorbachev then went to George Bush Sr. and Margaret Thatcher seeking financial aid to prop up his regime. At that point, Putin was a junior-ranking KGB guy, but watching it all either from Dresden or from Moscow. Thatcher said, no money unless you really reform. So Gorbachev then turned to these bright young men who were prepared to buy from him at a massive discount Russia's great wealth. They were the oligarchs. When Gorby fell and Yeltsin came in, Yeltsin was broke, Russia was broke, it accelerated. At this point, Putin was in there, in the mix, rising through the ranks of the Communist Party, never a communist, always a man interested in Mother Russia and in money. He learnt his trade, he took over from Yeltsin, and the rest, Alex, is history. For him, it's about image, as you've just brilliantly portrayed. He learned that from Gorbachev, who went walkabout in Washington. I remember reporting upon that. Russian leaders didn't tend to do that. They tended to bang their heels at the United Nations like Khrushchev. He learned that. But he genuinely believes in Mother Russia, as Mark and Valery just said, and he genuinely believes in money. That's what this is all about. It's whether or not the oligarchs think their money is now at risk.
I mean, sticking on the theme of money, as I said, he was Forbes Man of the Year more than anybody else in history, and he's been Times Magazine's Person of the Year as well. Do you think the West has played into his hands? Because a lot of the money he's been able to accrue and his oligarchs have been through extremely lucrative deals with the West that has now almost bound us in a Gordian knot when it comes to our energy supply, when it comes to the amount of Russian money, dirty Russian money, swilling around the City of London, when it comes to how much infrastructure, how football teams, so many things that Russian oligarchs now control. I mean, we've played into his hands.
Well, let me turn it slightly on its head, and I've been saying this on my weekend programmes now for 2 or 3 weeks. He's played the West utterly brilliantly, and it all hinges on that point that Mark just made to you towards the end of his contribution. And if you, there's a very good book by Ken Follett called Never, which is the same power play, but it's between the West and China. It's who blinks first. He doesn't believe that the man you're looking at the moment, and if you're listening on radio, it was just then Joe Biden, now you've panned across to Putin. He doesn't believe that Biden will intervene. Remember that magic word? Oh, incursion, a minor incursion. We're looking at a bloody murderous incursion in Ukraine right now, and we're shoring up the next line of defense. As Mark just said, the next line of defense will be Moldova. Well, they've got a little bit of Russian territory in there already. And then they'll look up at the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. He's absolutely convinced, in my view, that he can push his luck. At some juncture, someone is going to say no, and it'll either genuinely be NATO, and Stoltenberg has played an absolute blinder, in my view, really come to the fore, or it'll be the oligarchs. And if they say, look, guys, those billions are at stake. We've already lost our apartments in Knightsbridge. We've lost our yachts that we had moored up in Germany and St. Moritz and the rest of it. Not St. Moritz, Saint-Tropez. If that's at stake, if we're going to lose that, he's got to go. And out he will go like that.
Alistair, thank you ever so much. Always great to be joined by you. Alistair Stewart, our very own. Putin's gone tonto. The words of Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, as Western powers and media try to apportion blame to a sharp decline in his mental capacity. There are reports he has become increasingly isolated, demanding the few aides that he has quarantine for weeks before meeting him and provide twice-weekly fecal samples. Other suggestions include that he refuses to ever watch media and is totally detached from the world. Some have suggested he had treatments for cancer of the spine in a private clinic in East Germany, while others allege he has Parkinson's disease. The ageing leader also shows signs of significant cosmetic surgery, betraying the caricature of a man perhaps losing self-esteem and in the desperate throes of expediting a legacy before his own demise. But perhaps more simply, Putin has always been a sociopath, able to manipulate while concealing his own true nature. Well, let's talk to the psychologist and broadcaster Emma Kenny. Emma, do you buy this idea that Vladimir Putin has gone tonto, or do you see clinically signs in him of something that is far more long-term and long-standing?
I think that it would be easier for us to imagine and stretch our heads around the idea that there was some cognitive decline and that's making him make terrible decisions. But I think when you think historically about his actions and his history, the chances are, as you just noted, he's somebody who's highly determined and he's decided on a course of action, and that course of action is something he's willing to pursue, even when it involves loss. And that's interesting and intriguing because of the fact that for the average human, we weigh things up. And if we think that things are going to cost us quite dearly, we tend to avoid going on that course of action. But as you noted, using the word sociopath, if you're an individual who doesn't really care about the impact on anybody else, and you have a vision of what you want, and it's irrelevant the destruction that you create, as long as you feel that you're going to meet those aims, you'll carry on down that road. And I guess we could also bring in something like hubris syndrome, where clearly he's had power for a very long time. There'll be a lot of dopamine that he's kind of reinforced with when he takes actions that reinforce that power. And so to some degree, it really doesn't matter whether he's isolated or whether, in other words, we consider what his actions are be delusionary. As far as he is concerned, he has a course of action. He wants to be powerful. And I think what was just noted by Alistair was actually on the money. I think genuinely he is seeing the West as being incredibly weak, and we will not fight him in the way that he would consider appropriate. And because of that, he's going to take full advantage of that.
I mean, how much is the fact that he is aging, the fact that it seems by looking at his face he has pursued significant cosmetic surgery, the fact that there are reports that he might be ill and perhaps he thinks his tenure is at risk of coming to an untimely end, how much might that be compelling him and propelling him to take pretty extreme actions when it comes to fulfilling what indeed may be his ambitions and his dream?
I think if you have a huge ego, then you will go out of your way to prove to the world that that ego is something that you are deserving of. So consequently, if you're coming, shall we say, into your latter years and you know that your time is limited, then making your mark and making a significant mark may become more important to you than, shall we say, seeing sense or thinking about human life. So I agree with you. I think that could definitely be a determining factor in his actions right now. I guess the bigger question is having that knowledge and awareness, both politically, psychologically, from the history that we're hearing about him. The bigger question is ultimately the damage that could be done with that psychological manifestation and with that kind of, as you noted, potentially sociopathic personality. With those combined, that's dangerous. So automatically, we have to draw ourselves to the conclusions that we are going to have to take some kind of action, because unless he is deposed, unless he is removed from that situation, clearly he's going to do huge damage. And we're seeing that in the loss of life of civilians and children in the Ukraine. And that is something that's happening day in and day out. And I think it's really important that somebody decides to take a very affirmative action to manage this situation. He's not going anywhere.
Yeah, Emma Kenny, I don't think he is he? People like Putin cannot be negotiated with, as many world leaders have found out over the past few weeks. Emma Kenny, psychologist. Well, that's about it for now. A fascinating insight into the mind of the man waging war against Europe. You can join me again for We Need to Talk About on GB News at the same time, 2 o'clock next week. Coming up next, it's the briefing with Darren McCaffrey. First, it's time for the weather forecast. You are able to catch up with this programme again on our app and on YouTube. It's, however, the end of the week for me. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Hello. Big contrasts with the weather this Friday. A fairly dull, dismal day across much of the east. Whereas in the west, well, there are 1 or 2 showers, but many places dry and bright with some spring sunshine, thanks to this little ridge of high pressure. This weather front, though, has been with us for a few days now, and it's just ground to a halt across these eastern parts of England, bringing thick cloud, rain and drizzle on and off for much of the day. Parts of eastern Scotland also being affected. Parts of East Anglia still largely dry, and we could reach double figures in Norwich with a bit of brightness, but stuck under this rain band from Newcastle to Hull. Temperatures really only 5, 6, 7 at best. Further west, a few showers for Wales and southwest England, but many places dry and bright, and temperatures 8, 9, 10 Celsius. Through this evening, we'll keep a few showers in the west, and we'll keep that wet weather across the east, although it should start to peter out across the far northeast of England. Staying fairly soggy, though, across East Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and rain on and off across southeast England and East Anglia for most of the night. Keeping the temperatures up here, but with clearer skies further west, a frost likely, certainly for Scotland, Northern Ireland, a fairly widespread frost to start the weekend, but should be some cracking sunshine here on Saturday. Now, yesterday we thought this rain may be a little further north, but now it looks like it will be mostly across these eastern parts of England, south of Lincolnshire into the East Midlands. A dull, damp day here on Saturday. Brighter skies for Wales and southwest England, some sunshine likely here, and as I said, a fine day for Scotland and Northern Ireland. After that, early frost temperatures picking up to 8 or 9 degrees, but it's quite a bit colder than that, stuck under that thick cloud, rain and drizzle, which will persist across these eastern parts of England, and easterly winds starting to pick up as well. That will eventually start to chase the rain away during Saturday night and into Sunday. Just a few showers on Sunday, but many places dry, with a fair bit of cloud across England and Wales and a cold easterly wind blowing too.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing, your afternoon fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis. I'm Arlene Foster and here's what's coming up over the next hour. It has been more than a week since the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, and we will be speaking to a member of the Ukrainian Parliament who is in Kyiv. Is the West doing enough? We are joined